Picture this. You wake up one morning, and somehow, against all logic and reason, you find yourself standing in a muddy field somewhere in the American colonies. It is 1776. The air smells of black powder smoke, rotting wood, wet wool, and something else you cannot quite identify, but very much wish you could not smell at all. Somewhere in the distance, a drum is beating a slow, ominous rhythm. A man next to you is handing you a musket that weighs nearly 10 pounds, a cartridge box filled with paper-wrapped rounds, and a bayonet about the length of your forearm. He is telling you to stand in line, to stand still, and whatever you do, not to run. Welcome to the American Revolutionary War battlefield. Most of us carry some romantic notion of this conflict in our heads, a picture assembled from patriotic paintings, heroic films, and school textbooks that tend to skip over the more unpleasant details. We imagine brave men in bright uniforms, firing their muskets in the golden afternoon light, winning their independence through sheer force of will and righteousness. We imagine something almost noble. The reality, as it almost always is when it comes to history, was something very different. The American Revolutionary War, fought between 1775 and 1783, was one of the most physically brutal, medically catastrophic, psychologically shattering experiences a human being could endure in the 18th century. And you, a modern person with your antibiotics, and your hand sanitizer, and your running shoes, and your understanding of germ theory, would almost certainly not survive a single day of it. Today, we are going to find out why. Welcome to the show. Let us start from the very beginning, from the moment you are recruited, because that moment alone would be a shock to your system. If you were lucky enough to join the Continental Army, the professional force established by the Continental Congress in June 1775, you would quickly discover that the word professional was doing a lot of very heavy lifting. In the early years of the war, enlistment terms were dangerously short. Many men signed up for only a few months at a time. George Washington himself spent considerable energy writing desperate letters to Congress, begging for longer enlistment terms, because just as men were becoming trained and useful soldiers, they would simply go home. Entire regiments evaporated at critical moments in the war, sometimes on the very eve of battle. When you arrived at camp, you would be given a uniform, if there was one available, which frequently there was not. The supply situation for the Continental Army was catastrophic for much of the war. Soldiers went without shoes. They went without coats in winter. They went without food. At Valley Forge, in the winter of 1777 to 1778, nearly 2,500 men, roughly a quarter of the army stationed there, died from disease, malnutrition, and exposure, not from enemy action, from cold and hunger and sickness. Washington wrote of men without proper clothing, men without blankets, men marching through snow and leaving trails of blood from their bare feet. This was not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. Archaeological and documentary evidence confirms the scale of suffering at Valley Forge and at other winter encampments throughout the war. If you were a loyalist, you might instead find yourself serving in one of the provincial corps aligned with the British Crown, such as Tarleton's British Legion or the Queen's Rangers. These units were often better supplied than the Continental forces, but they faced their own particular horrors, including the bitter hatred of their neighbors, and the knowledge that capture might mean not a prisoner of war camp, but a noose. And if you were an ordinary militiaman, a part-time soldier, called up for specific engagements before returning to your farm, then your situation was perhaps the most precarious of all. You had little training, minimal equipment, and the terrifying task of standing in a line of battle against professional soldiers who had been drilling their musket volleys since they were teenagers. Any way you came to it, the Revolutionary War battlefield was going to be an experience you were almost certainly not ready for. Let us talk about the most important piece of equipment you would carry into battle, the flintlock musket. Understanding this weapon is essential to understanding almost everything else about how these battles were fought. and why standing in a line was considered sound. The standard infantry musket of the Revolutionary War era was a smoothbore flintlock. For the British, this meant the brown bess. The Continental Army used French muskets supplied after 1778, CAPTURED British Arms, and domestically produced firearms like the Pennsylvania long rifle. The brown bess fired a .75 caliber lead ball, roughly the diameter of your thumb, and weighed up to 14 pounds with its bayonet. Loading it required tearing open a paper cartridge with your teeth, pouring powder, and ramming the ball home with an iron ramrod. Then you would prime the pan, cock the hammer, and hope the flint would strike the steel with enough force to send a spark. Hoping, because the system was profoundly unreliable. In dry conditions, it had a misfire rate of 15%. In wet weather, it was much worse. The smoothbore barrel meant that the ball drifted unpredictably. Individual aimed fire was largely pointless. It was designed for mass volley fire. This is why tactics looked so suicidal. Soldiers stood in tight lines, reloaded while being fired at, and advanced toward the enemy at a controlled pace. The Pennsylvania long rifle was different. With a rifled barrel and far greater accuracy, it was devastating in the hands of a skilled marksman. But the rifle took twice as long to load and couldn't accept a bayonet, making the rifleman vulnerable once the enemy closed the distance. Nothing in your modern life has prepared you for what a revolutionary war battle actually sounded like up close. Nothing. Black powder produced an enormous cloud of thick, acrid white smoke. Within minutes, the battlefield became completely obscured. The volley of a regiment was audible from miles away. Add to this the boom of artillery, the screaming of horses, and the drums and fifes. The smell was equally assaulting. Black powder smoke, blood, the sweat of thousands, and the mud and manure of the field. You felt a deep, animal terror. The only thing between you and death was your ability to follow orders and load your musket with shaking hands. Many soldiers experienced a breakdown of cognitive function. Some froze, others ran or loaded their muskets without firing, stacking balls in the barrel. Historians found muskets at Gettysburg loaded with multiple charges, some with 23 balls. This is physical evidence of psychological breakdown. The Battle of Bunker Hill illustrates this. British forces made 3 uphill charges against American defenders. The losses were horrifying. Of the 2,300 British troops engaged, nearly half became casualties in a single afternoon. This was the gritty reality of 18th century warfare. If you survived the musket volleys, and that was very much not guaranteed, there was always the bayonet. The socket bayonet was a triangular bladed weapon about 17 inches long. It attached to the barrel, converting the musket into a spear. The triangular cross-section was a deliberate design choice. Unlike a flat blade, it left a wound that was extremely difficult to treat. Bayonet charges were psychologically devastating. The knowledge that men intended to physically stab you was often enough to break a formation. At the Battle of Camden, the British bayonet charge triggered a complete rout of the American left wing, causing militia units to flee in panic. When bayonets did connect, the results were catastrophic. Survivors describe organized chaos, men wrestling and using musket butts as clubs in the mud. In September 1777, the Paoli massacre occurred. British forces under Major General Charles Grey launched a silent night attack on Anthony Wayne's forces. Grey ordered his men to remove flints, ensuring the attack would be entirely silent and conducted entirely with bayonets and swords. The British used the bayonet as a tool of psychological warfare. American forces eventually learned to answer in kind at the Battle of Stony Point. Of all the weapons, artillery was most likely to cause mass casualties. Nothing could prepare you for an artillery piece firing at close range. The standard field artillery fired solid shot. At close range, a 12-pound ball could pass through a dozen men standing in line. But solid shot was not the most terrifying. Canister shot and grape shot turned the cannon into an enormous shotgun, killing dozens with one discharge. Then there was the howitzer, which fired explosive shells, hollow iron balls filled with gunpowder that burst in the air or on impact. Henry Knox heroically hauled captured British guns from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston, a journey of 300 miles through snow and ice. Artillery was dangerous to operate. Misfires and overheated barrels killed gun crews, who stood within feet of explosions in thick clouds of smoke. Imagine you are a new recruit. The noise of a British battery is a concussive wave you feel in your chest, and it is aimed at you. This is where the history gets very dark, very quickly, and where the gap between the Revolutionary War and modern medicine becomes terrifying. If you were hit by a musket ball, you were struck by a lead projectile the diameter of your thumb, traveling at 1,000 feet per second. Lead is soft and deforms on impact. The ball expanded and tumbled, shattering bone rather than passing cleanly through it. It carried cloth fibers and dirt from your uniform into the wound, leaving an exit wound, sometimes the size of a fist. The standard treatment for a limb wound was amputation, not because surgeons were barbaric, but because the alternative was almost certainly death from infection. A shattered bone with metal and dirt ground into the marrow, in a pre-antibiotic world, was a death sentence. Amputation removed the source of infection. Revolutionary War surgeons were known as sawbones. A military surgeon was measured by his speed. An amputation in under 3 minutes was considered excellent. In an era before general anesthetic, speed was mercy. The patient was given rum or brandy, and the operation was conducted as rapidly as possible. Even with success, risks were enormous. Wound fever, now recognized as bacterial infection, killed many. Tetanus and gangrene were common death sentences. The mortality rate for thigh amputations was roughly 50%, meaning a coin flip between survival and death even after surgery. Abdominal wounds were effectively untreatable. Head and chest wounds left men to die slowly over hours or days, with no tools to manage them. The field hospital was a scene from a nightmare. Tables were covered in blood. Piles of amputated limbs accumulated, as there was no time for disposal. Men lay on straw, moaning or silent with shock. The smell was indescribable, and the psychological effect on everyone involved was lasting and profound. Here's the most important statistic. Of 25,000 deaths in the Continental Army, only 6,800 were killed in battle. The other 18,500 died of disease. Not musket balls, not bayonets. Smallpox, dysentery, typhus, and pneumonia. Illnesses that modern medicine has either eliminated or made treatable. Smallpox was the most feared. It killed 30% of those infected and spread with terrifying speed through every army camp. The 1775 epidemic ravaged American forces in Canada. Washington, immune since youth, recognized the catastrophe and ordered the inoculation of the army. Variolation involved deliberately infecting a person with smallpox material. It was dangerous, but it conferred immunity and likely saved the American victory. Dysentery was endemic. Camp sanitation was appalling. Latrines were dug too close to water sources. Men drank from streams others were defecating into. Typhus, spread by body lice, flourished. Men could not wash clothing or change for weeks, making them ideal hosts for the disease. The British prison ships in New York Harbor became typhus factories. More Americans died on those ships than in all the battles combined. Malaria afflicted the South, while at Valley Forge, malnutrition weakened immune systems, turning minor respiratory ailments into fatal ones. Bad food was a constant threat. Contractors supplied rotten meat and weevil-infested flour. Men ate what they could, often getting violently ill. The body of a soldier was under constant assault, not just from the enemy, but from everything around him. History was won through this grit. Most accounts of Revolutionary War battles focus on the fighting itself. But the fighting was often the shortest part of a campaign. Getting to the battle, that was where the real suffering happened. Revolutionary War armies moved on foot. Officers and cavalry rode horses, but the ordinary infantrymen walked. Everything, everywhere. A typical day's march covered 15 to 20 miles, sometimes more, under urgent conditions, across roads that were frequently nothing more than dirt tracks. In summer heat, it could reach 100 degrees, and in winter cold, it could fall well below freezing. And you did this carrying your musket, your cartridge box, your bayonet, your knapsack, and often additional equipment like entrenching tools. The march to the Battle of Trenton on December 26, 1776, the famous crossing of the Delaware, is perhaps the most celebrated. But the actual experience of those 2,400 men was one of extreme physical suffering. They crossed the river at night in a brutal nor'easter storm. Men who were already exhausted, hungry, and inadequately clothed marched 9 miles in darkness, in a blizzard, to attack the Hessian garrison. 2 men froze to death during the march. It is a miracle that the attack succeeded at all. Footwear was a particular agony. Many Continental soldiers fought and marched in shoes that were worn through, patched with bark or cloth. The image of bloody footprints in the snow at Valley Forge was not rhetorical embellishment. It was fact. Men with frostbitten feet, or who were developing the early stages of gangrene, continued to march because there was no alternative. Blisters, in a world before modern footwear, were open wounds. Open wounds in a world without antiseptic were potential death sentences. Trench foot was a constant threat in any wet campaign season. Hunger was a near constant companion. The Continental Army's supply situation was frequently catastrophic. Men marched on empty stomachs and ate whatever they could forage. This sometimes meant eating livestock belonging to local farmers, which contributed to the alienation of the civilian population. To understand the psychological demands, you need to understand the tactics of the era, which ran counter to every survival instinct. Linear tactics were a logical response to the limitations of the smoothbore flintlock musket. 100 soldiers firing simultaneously produced a wall of lead. Maintaining formation under fire meant standing still while men shot at you. It meant watching the man next to you fall and not breaking. It meant continuing to load your musket with shaking hands while the smoke burned your eyes and the screaming of the wounded filled the air. Officers were expected to set an example of calm under fire. They walked slowly in front of their men, giving orders in measured tones. The casualties among officers were staggering. At the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, both sides lost enormous numbers of officers. The British Army maintained its formations better under fire. The 49 lashes of the Cat O'9 tails for breaking ranks was a real deterrent. American militia were particularly prone to breaking under pressure. These were men with families, farms, and no professional training. When a British bayonet charge came crashing toward them, many ran. But a broken unit that reassembled was often more useful than one that died. Nathaniel Greene built his campaign around this. He used militia as a skirmishing screen, drawing British forces into overextended territory. It was a strategy that ultimately exhausted British forces and paved the way for the Yorktown campaign that ended the war. Modern military psychology has given us a vocabulary for the psychological wounds of war that the 18th century entirely lacked. Post-traumatic stress disorder, acute combat stress reaction, moral injury. These are terms developed in the modern era to describe ancient phenomena. In the Revolutionary War, the psychological damage done by combat had no name and no treatment. Men returned shaking, unable to sleep. Those who could not discuss what they had seen were simply said to be unwell. Their families and communities often did not understand. Joseph Plum Martin, a Connecticut soldier, described the progressive numbing that came with prolonged exposure to combat and hardship. By the war's end, he moved through scenes of carnage with detachment. a psychological defense mechanism we would now recognize immediately. Veterans returned to a society with no framework for understanding trauma. There were no veterans' hospitals or adequate disability payments. The pension system was inadequate and the subject of bitter political disputes for decades after the war concluded. Moral injury occurred when actions violated one's own moral framework. The war involved guerrilla warfare and the burning of farms. Both sides committed atrocities. Men who watched women and children flee burning homes carried those memories for the rest of their lives. The Paoli massacre created a particular trauma. Survivors, bayoneted in the dark while sleeping, carried that experience into every subsequent battle. At the Battle of Germantown, Continental units reportedly shouted, "Remember Paoli," as they charged, seeking vengeance over tactical discipline. The story of the Revolutionary War is not only about white male soldiers. Women were present at every level of the effort. Camp followers served as laundresses, cooks, and nurses. They were even present on the battlefield, carrying water to gun crews. Molly Pitcher represents the reality that women actively participated in combat, serving artillery pieces when their husbands fell. Margaret Corbin was wounded at Fort Washington while serving a cannon. She was the first woman to receive a federal pension. The situation of Black Americans was complicated. Lord Dunmore's proclamation offered freedom to enslaved people who joined British forces. Meanwhile, free Black Americans and enslaved men promised freedom fought with the Continental Army from the very beginning. Crispus Attucks was among the first to die in the Boston Massacre. Later, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment fought with distinction. Salem Corps was praised as a brave and gallant soldier. Yet a profound contradiction remained, a revolution for liberty in a slave-holding society. Enslaved people fought for whichever side offered freedom, making them among the most consequential and forgotten participants in the war. The battle was over. The smoke was settling. And now came work that in some ways was worse than the fighting itself. Collecting the dead and wounded from a Revolutionary War battlefield was a matter of urgency, because bodies in warm weather decomposed rapidly and became disease vectors. But it was also a matter of extreme psychological difficulty, because the men doing the collecting were the same men who had just spent hours fighting. Burial was hasty and inadequate. Individual graves were rare luxuries. Mass graves, sometimes nothing more than a trench with a thin layer of soil, were the norm. Accounts describe bodies lying unburied for days, decomposing in summer heat, stripped of shoes and clothing by soldiers who needed them more than the dead did. At the Battle of the Waxhaws in May 1780, British cavalry under Banastre Tarleton reportedly killed men who were attempting to surrender and those already wounded. The event entered American memory as Tarleton's Quarter, a phrase meaning no mercy, and inflamed the war in the South to a degree that made it brutal. Prisoners of war faced their own particular hell. The British prison ships in New York Harbor, principally the HMS Jersey, were floating charnel houses. Men slept on bare lower decks, ate rotten food, and died of typhus and smallpox at a rate that shocked even contemporaries. The estimated death toll on the Jersey exceeds 11,000, more Americans than died in all the battles of the entire war combined. One aspect of Revolutionary War service that receives less attention is the long stretches of time spent in winter quarters, extended exercises in collective suffering. The winter of 1779 to 1780 was the coldest of the century. The Hudson River froze solid enough to drive artillery across. The huts built at Valley Forge were crude log structures. They were cold, smoky, damp, and infested with lice and fleas. Boredom, despair, and homesickness produced depression on a mass scale. Washington dealt with desertion through both punishment and his personal moral authority. Friedrich von Steuben, the Prussian drill master, transformed the army. He introduced a version of drill that could be learned by American soldiers. The siege of Yorktown in 1781 is where the war effectively ended. illustrating how much the Continental Army had changed through bitter experience. The storming of redoubts 9 and 10 on the night of October 14, 1781, saw American forces under Alexander Hamilton move with fixed bayonets. Cornwallis surrendered on October 19, 1781. The British band played "The World Turned Upside Down," a most apt piece of music. A colonial force that was expected to collapse had, after 6 years of suffering, defeated the most powerful military force on earth. So let us return to you, a modern person, standing in a muddy field in 1776, a musket in your hands, the drum beating. You would probably not survive because of what the environment, disease, cold, and the psychological assault of combat did to them. The miracle is not that so many of them died. The miracle is that any of them survived. The miracle is that they won. Next week, we take a look at the extraordinary cases of military mutiny and moral refusal during the Revolutionary War. See you then.